it's an honor to have Dave back with us again. As many of you know, Dave is he's the head of the head of policy at the Community Security Trust, or the CST, which is really the preeminent Jewish security or community security protection organization. They will explain in more detail. It's really the preeminent in the world and is really the gold standard that I think communities all over the world are turning to in this moment of crisis. And Dave is on the leadership of this important organization. He also received a doctorate degree at Birkbeck College in London on issues of anti-Semitism. And so he's a doctor now on issues of anti-Semitism. And he wrote many important articles and books. And one important book that he's the author of is The Left's Jewish Problem, Jeremy Corbyn, Israel and Anti-Semitism. And I should also say, you know, as a person, a non-British person who spent many years in the UK and growing up in North America, we used to potentially, I don't know, ridicule the British Jewish establishment for being so quiet and working behind the scenes, and that we in North America, you know, we knew how to fight anti-Semitism and stand up for our rights. And yet, you know, in the last 5-6 years, with the threat of Jeremy Corbyn and rising anti-Semitism, the British Jewish community really stood up and united and fought back anti-Semitism in a very organized and efficient and powerful way. And Dave was a key member of these efforts, so it's great that he's here. And again, I think not only the CST, but perhaps the British Jewish community can offer us in North America some best practices as we finally, after many years of warnings, realize that the wave of hatred that swept through Europe is now alive and well in North America. So Dave, thank you for being here with us, and thanks for taking the time. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you.
Oh, and I should say one last thing. Dave is graciously in the CST team. At our Summer Institute at Oxford, we come every year. We bring the professors to visit the CST and to teach professors really what's going on the ground in terms of anti-Semitism that the CST confronts. That's a very important part of our project. So, Dave, sorry.
Thank you. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where in the world you are. We're going to be speaking over the next hour or so about the state of anti-Semitism in the UK. And of course, had we been holding this event, this webinar, prior to 7th of October last year, it would have been a very different conversation. We would have been talking about, yes, about the left and about what happened in the Labour Party, about how things have got much better, because they have. We'd have been talking about the terrorist threat to the Jewish community coming increasingly from teenage neo-Nazis who spend their whole time on kind of weird social media platforms in their bedrooms. We'd be talking about people like Elon Musk and other Kanye West and other kind of figures who come out of left field with huge followings, huge global followings, and come out with anti-Semitic comments and throw the whole Jewish world kind of off their axis for a week or so. And then, of course, 7th of October happened and threw us all off our Jewish axis for what feels like permanently, or certainly, you know, for as long as we can see into the future. And as ever, when Israel is attacked or when Israel is at war, we get these big surges in anti-Semitism around the world. And we've seen this in Britain too. And the fact that it happens every time shouldn't mean that we think it's normal, because it's not normal. You know, when Russia invaded Ukraine in February 22, there was no wave of anti-Russian hate crime in Britain. People did not go out chucking red paint over the front doors of Russian Orthodox churches or shouting abuse at Russian people in the street in any kind of significant numbers. It didn't happen. Same with the Saudi war in Yemen, for example. And yet, in October and November, the British police nationally recorded a 680% increase in anti-Semitic hate crime across England and Wales. I mean, 680%. I'm trying to think of what other metrics go up 680%. You know, when inflation is at 10%, we all panic. They're just off the scale. And this is reflected in CST's anti-Semitic incident figures as well. And these are only the ones that get reported to anyone. I'll get into some more detail about what this anti-Semitism looks like. But I just want to acknowledge how unusual it is and how unique it is in terms of foreign conflicts triggering outbreaks of hate crime in this way. And then we have the demonstrations and the protests. And these began on the 8th of October. So the Hamas terror attack was on the 7th of October. The first protests, which were in support of what Hamas had done, let's be clear about that, were held on the 8th of October. So in my hometown, Manchester, on the 8th, Sunday the 8th, the local Palestine solidarity groups marched through the city centre holding big banners saying, glory to the freedom fighters, Manchester supports the resistance. In Brighton, one of the speakers, who was an officer in the local Palestine Student Society at the local university, gave a speech that was so explicitly in support of Hamas that she has since been arrested and charged with glorification of terrorism. In Birmingham, the same. In London, on the evening of the afternoon and evening of Monday, the 9th of October, there was a demonstration outside the Israeli embassy. But the advertising this demonstration went out on the afternoon of Saturday the 7th, literally while Hamas was still holding hostages in Israeli towns and kibbutzim. The Palestine Solidarity Campaign, the National Group, the Stop the War Coalition, all the organisations that have organised all the big demos through central London since then. On that Saturday afternoon, they put out their advert calling for the first demonstration outside the Israeli embassy, and it was a demonstration to celebrate a victory, a Hamas win over Israel. These early protests in those early days did not call for a ceasefire. You know, the big demos we've seen 100,000 people, some people even say one of them, 300,000 people marching through central London every other Saturday in October and November and December. And the main slogan on these big demos has been to call for a ceasefire. And loads of ordinary people go on these protests, on these marches, because they want the war to stop, right? They want people to stop dying. They don't like seeing pictures in the news and on their smartphones of dead and injured children. And they genuinely want a ceasefire. But the organizations who organized these demonstrations, the first protest they organized in those days following 7th of October did not call for a ceasefire, because at that point Hamas were winning. They only started calling for a ceasefire when it was Israel bombing Gaza and sending ground forces into Gaza and so on. And it's important to remember that when we look at who's actually behind this movement. But even if most of the people on these rallies are just genuine humanitarians, and we don't know exactly how many are genuine humanitarians and how many are Hamas supporters or anti-Semitic, they are even if a lot of people on these marches are there for respectable reasons, for reasons that of sympathy, the people organizing the marches are hardcore groups with a very extreme position of wanting to see Israel disappear and effectively of supporting Hamas as an entity, and certainly not publicly condemning them. And it's important to remember that. Now, what does this tell us about anti-Semitism? One of the things I want to really hone in on, and I'm going to show you some pictures in a minute, is the minority of people on these big protests who take anti-Semitic placards with them, right? And it is a minority of people. Most of the people who go on these protests, they go along, they pick up a placard from the organizers, they walk down the route, they're pretty well behaved, it's pretty calm, and then they go home. But some people, they make their own placards and they bring them along because they have a burning desire to say what they really think about the Jews, or in their heads about the Zionists. And I'm going to show you some pictures now. I'm going to share my screen. Um, hopefully, that's my book. This is how it's felt since the 7th of October for all of us. It's felt like Jew hatred has been trending constantly. But these are pictures from the demos. And what I think is interesting and tells us something is that the anti-Semitic placards, the ideas, the imagery, the language, the tropes and stereotypes they draw on are very, very old. There's very little that's new in this, right? So this is an example of placards that draw on blood libel ideas. So the one on the left, literally figures with blood dripping from their mouth. Is our blood so sweet? They've been drinking Palestinian blood. The one on the right, slightly less explicit, but similar. It's the kind of old blood libel idea of Jews drinking blood, delighting in Palestinian blood, and so on. Which, of course, goes well back. There's Jews as the devil. So on the right, you've got Netanyahu as Satanyahu, again, drinking a bag of blood, if you look, and with a devil's tail. And on the left, you've got President Biden, but again, as a devil with blood dripping from his mouth with horns, and as the puppet master with an Israeli flag on his tie. So there's an element of conspiracy there. Again, these are old ideas. These are very traditional anti-Semitic conspiracy ideas. The one on the left is an idea, a kind of trope and a theme that we've seen a lot, actually. I'll read it to you if you can't read it clearly. It says, the only crime the Palestinians have committed is accepting you as refugees while you were kicked out of every country in Europe. Now, apart from the fact that it completely distorts the history of the Arab national response to Jewish immigration into Palestine prior to the creation of the State of Israel, which of course was not welcoming and accepting in the way that this placard claims, it takes the history of anti-Semitism and it throws it back onto Jewish people. And it's almost the implicit subtext is, if only the Palestinians had known what everyone else knew when they kicked you out of their countries, we wouldn't have accepted you. It's kind of that idea, and again with blood dripping. And on the right with Nelson's column in the background, so there's from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, which is the slogan that is very common on all these protests. But I wanted to draw your attention to the other placard. The Zionist lies more than it breathes, right? And it's the word it, it's the dehumanization, and it's the trope of the dishonest Zion, that lying is intrinsic to being a Zionist. And again, it's a very old anti-Semitic trope that Jews can't be trusted, that Jews lie and are deceitful as part of their innate character. Then you have classic conspiracy stuff. So on the left, media, TV, radio, government, all controlled by Zionists. And on the right, a woman with a t-shirt, "Stop the Zionist New World Order." Now, the New World Order is a slogan that the American far right developed and popularized after the end of the Cold War. President Bush, the senior, gave a speech after the collapse of communism about how there was a new world order. He meant of, peace and prosperity and unity and democracy and all the rest of it. And the conspiracist far right took this to mean one world government and the Zionists are taking over. And I can guarantee this woman thinks she's left-wing and thinks she's progressive. And yet she's even made a t-shirt or bought a t-shirt, probably off a website online, with a classic far-right conspiracist slogan on it and worn it to a pro-Palestinian protest. Here's another one. And this is like a classic combination of blending of old and new. So if you look at the picture, first of all, you've got an Israeli snake, a snake with the Star of David and the Israeli flag wrapped around the globe. Now, anyone who is familiar with the imagery of French anti-Semitism at the time of Dreyfus, German anti-Semitism in the first part of the 20th century, this kind of imagery was very common. Kind of the Jewish snake wrapped around the globe, the conspiracist image. It really goes back to those kind of times. And you've got, child killers in the writing. You've got child killers, which is blood libel and liars, which I've spoken about before. But then within that, you've got very modern tropes, land grabbers, oppressors, Zionists. You know, this is very new and yet very old, all mixed together. And the headline, of course, is that Israel is the worst terror state in history. So, you know, worse than Nazi Germany, worse than Stalinist Soviet Union, worse than any other kind of mass killer you can think of. Obviously, loads of Holocaust comparisons. I mean, this is just ubiquitous on these marches. So on the left, you've got End the Palestinian Holocaust. On the right, you've got Gaza twin with Auschwitz. And in the middle, you've got the Star of David sort of entwined with the swastika. And these are everywhere. And especially if it's not the word Holocaust being used or the swastikas explicitly, but talk of genocide. I mean, we've seen the case coming up in the International Court this week, brought by South Africa. This is the most dominant theme of all this language. And it's only a short step from accusing Israel of committing genocide to saying Gaza is twinned with Auschwitz and putting a swastika on your placard. And it's quite notable, I think, that nowadays you're much more likely to find a swastika on a placard at an anti-Israel protest than you are at a far-right protest in Britain. The far right tend to find other ways to display their extremism and their racism and their anti-Semitism, but they don't tend to wave swastikas because they get arrested. The place you're most likely to find a placard with a swastika on it is an anti-Israel demonstration. I'm pleased to say the police have now started to arrest people for carrying placards like this, which is progress of a sort. And then there is this one, which I think really sums up exactly where we are when I talk about the blending of the old and the new, is the one on the left. You have an effigy, a mock-up of a Palestinian child on a cross, so evoking the crucifixion. And we saw a lot of this over Christmas, a lot of social media, a lot of stuff on social media and Twitter and so on, of claiming Jesus as a Palestinian. Either that Jesus historically was a Palestinian, or that Jesus, his place is now taken by Palestinians as kind of with the purity of suffering and victimhood. And of course, it repeats the original anti-Semitic trope of Jewish deicide, that the Jews were responsible for the death of Christ. And it's almost a coincidental juxtaposition, but I think it says a lot. In the same picture, you have the most modern of anti-Semitic tropes, which is Zionism is white settler colonialism. And this again is everywhere. This is the framing. For all these marches, all these protests, so much of the campaigning against Israel now, the framing is that Israel is and Zionism are white settler colonialism. And of course, there's a connection. Because if Jesus was Jewish or Judean, if he lived at a time when the land, part of the land, Jerusalem and the land that is now Israel, was Judea, was controlled by Jews, then Zionism can't be settler colonialism, because the Jews have to have some legitimate claim. You know, you can have your arguments as to whether Palestinians also have a legitimate claim, and is that really a sensible way to construct modern political arrangements, and so on, whatever. But the denial of Jewish indigeneity and authenticity and legitimacy of Israel's claim is predicated on this idea that there were never Jews there, or certainly they never had sovereignty. And so therefore Jesus can't have been Jewish, he had to be Palestinian. So there's a link. And there's also a link in this kind of very binary struggle for victimhood. That there has to be pure victimhood, pure oppressed on one side, a purity of oppressed on one side, and the other side have to be wholly the oppressors and cannot be the victims. And we've seen this over these so many years in how the Israel-Palestine conflict is framed within this politics. And this goes back to the previous slide of trying to claim that what's happening in Gaza is a Holocaust, is akin to Auschwitz, because if Jesus was the kind of the original historic symbol of the purity of suffering and purity of victimhood from the ancient world, then Holocaust victims kind of play that role in the modern world. in modern politics, in modern Holocaust commemoration. Of course, we're coming up to Holocaust Memorial Day. So there's this effort to reclaim Jesus as the ancient symbol and the Holocaust as the modern symbol of the purity of suffering, the purity of victimhood, and claim that for the Palestinians, and therefore detach it entirely from Israel. Israel cannot be a victim because they are settler colonizers. And because they are settler colonizers, they have no rights. And so much of what we see about the either the denial of what Hamas did on the 7th of October or just the disinterest, so many of the statements we've seen from academics, from artists, from all sorts of other people condemning Israel and making no mention of what Hamas did on the 7th of October, no mention of the hostages, just as if it never happened, is because if they're settler colonizers, they don't really have rights. So what do you expect? And the image on the right just illustrates the way this has slipped into, it's fitted into the kind of template provided by modern identity politics. It was there long before Black Lives Matter movement and the politics of Black Lives Matter became so dominant in this world, but it certainly was kind of supercharged by that movement. And it's this idea that the world is split into, as this placard says, you're either on the white side of history or the right side of history, and Israel, Britain, France, America are the white side. Now, this does a few things. It completely obliterates the diversity of color within the Jewish world, the diversity of color within Israeli society, the whole history of Mizrahi Jews, and the persecution and discrimination they experienced in Arab and Muslim majority countries, and their role in Israeli society today. It's a completely flawed and unhelpful framing for understanding why there is conflict between Israel and Palestinians and how that might be solved. If you think Israel are settler colonizers, then the answer is they should all go back to their home countries. By home countries, of course, they don't mean Iraq and Yemen and Morocco. They mean Poland and France and the United States. And of course, that's not what the conflict is about at all. But this is the dominant framing on so much of the anti-Israel left in the West nowadays. Now, when I look at these placards, I always think to myself, these people, they've sat at home on the morning of this rally, or maybe the day before, with a blank piece of cardboard and a marker pen or a paintbrush or whatever. And they've thought to themselves, what is the most important message I can put on my placard to show my support for the people of Gaza? And so often they come up with a message, not so much like the image on these slides, but the blood libel images, the Jews as devils, the conspiracy images, the Nazi imagery. They come up with images that come deep from the history of anti-Semitism and messages that come deep from that history. And when I sort of ask myself, what is it, where do they get this? Where do they get this? And the answer is they get it from, on the one hand, the social media apps on their phones, and on the other hand, from the Middle Ages. And it's that blending of old and new, that kind of medieval wine in digital bottles is kind of how I've put it, that explains one reason why the anti-Semitism comes back so often at times like this is because it is so deeply embedded. It literally is kind of built into our world in many ways. It's built into our cultural understandings of who Jews are and what Jews mean, and the symbolism laid onto Jews and anything Jewish by which Israel has kind of inherited. And what we also see in some of the anti-Semitic incidents, we're moving from the protests to the incidents that we see. And so many of these, it's the taking of pro-Palestinian language and imagery and the kind of forcing it into Jewish spaces in an intimidatory way. So this is, for those of you who can look at the bus stop, this is Golders Green, which is probably the best known Jewish neighborhood in Britain, or neighborhood with the best known Jewish community. And overnight, on the night of the 8th of October, morning of the 9th, there are two big railway bridges crossing the two main roads that go through this neighborhood. And in big letters, people daubed the slogans "Free Palestine" on both bridges. This is one picture of one of them, but they were on both sides of both bridges. And it's big. I went there the next morning to look at them and take this picture. It would have taken a group of people quite a long time to do this. Now, they might be local residents, but my bet is that they're not. My bet is that they came to Golders Green because they wanted to send a statement to the Jewish community. And it's an intimidatory attack. And it's an example of where the language they use, the phrase "Free Palestine," in an ordinary context, it's not an anti-Semitic phrase, right? We can argue what it means, but basically it's a political phrase. Someone marching on a pro-Palestinian protest with a banner saying "Free Palestine," big deal. But they come to Golders Green and daub it on a railway bridge. They're trying to intimidate the Jewish community. It's a targeted, offensive act. And there are a few different examples of this. This is an Israeli restaurant in London called Baladi. They do the best falafel in London, and they have a few branches. And this is one where someone, again, has daubed "Free Palestine" on the doors. Right now, it's got Hebrew and Arabic on the restaurant. They're lovely people. No one's asked them what they think of the war. No one's asked them if they support Israel invading Gaza, if they support Netanyahu. They don't care. It's the fact that they are Israeli, therefore they are dehumanized. They are this kind of abstract target. Now, what actually happened is one of the neighbors who lives nearby was who isn't Jewish, was appalled by this and left a note on the front door saying, "I'm so sorry this has happened. When I get back from work, I'm going to help you paint it off, clean it off for you," because most people are appalled by this kind of thing. But it's just an example. These are two others where it's moving from Israeli spaces more into Jewish spaces. So on the left, you have a Jewish school, which was one of two Jewish schools in London that had red paint thrown on the doors, the front doors, obviously to symbolize blood. On the right is a synagogue, actually my parents' old synagogue, with the letters SS in the Nazi style and IDF painted on the wall. So this is moving from public spaces, a railway bridge, through Israeli locations, an Israeli restaurant, into explicitly and solely Jewish community places. But again, it's the same. It's this attempt to force themselves and their message into places where the Jewish community cannot avoid it, cannot hide. And this is another one, the word Gaza daubed on the sign outside a very well-known, respected Holocaust library. Some of you may well know it, the Wiener Library in London, which is Britain's kind of premier Holocaust research centre. And they've daubed Gaza on the sign. So even the Holocaust, as a kind of conceptual Jewish space, a historical Jewish event, is not, it's not kind of free of this. There's no sanctuary. It's not separate. And it's this attempt to just constantly force themselves in a harassing, intimidatory way. And this has happened over the posters. I'm sure we've all seen this, right? This is an example of someone has smeared. This is in the United States, but we've seen this all over Britain. People put up hostage posters and other people rip it down. Why do they rip them down? They rip them down for lots of reasons. One is because they don't believe there are any hostages, because a lot of them are conspiracy theorists. But I think the core reason is it's a total dehumanization of Israelis. And I put this up because it was tweeted by a left-wing Israeli academic based in London, who, and he asked in his tweet the question, he made a very valid, rational, sensible point that if people want a ceasefire, they shouldn't be attacking the hostages, because the hostage families in Israel are one of the primary kind of moderating forces on the Israeli government, that they want the Israeli government to make a deal to get the hostages out. But of course, that's not the point. That's not the point. The people doing this, they don't really want a ceasefire so much as they want Israel to be defeated. because they don't think Israelis, even 12-year-old Israeli children, have rights. And then this is the last thing I want to show you. And I want to talk about children in the last part I talk about, because we have been seeing for the last few years some really worrying trends about anti-Semitic attitudes amongst younger people. Broadly speaking, lots of opinion polling about attitudes towards Jews, and in particular attitudes towards conspiracy theories about Jews, have shown that people under the age of 35 are much more likely to hold anti-Jewish attitudes and believe anti-Jewish conspiracy theories than people over the age of 50. There's a real break point. There's a real generational split. And it correlates with social media use. The more that people use social media as their primary source of news and information, the more likely they are to believe any conspiracy theories about anything, and therefore about Jews. And there's a few reasons for this. One of them is, of course, that anti-Semitism works as a conspiracy theory rather than or as well as a kind of straightforward prejudice. So younger people in Britain, every opinion poll tells us, are less racist in terms of basic prejudice than their elders, but they're also more anti-Semitic. So you got this sort of detachment, this detaching, these countervailing trends. Now I'm going to play you this video, which was from the TikTok account of a group called Hackney for Palestine. Hackney is a borough in East London, which, for those of you who don't know it, it has a very large, strictly Orthodox Jewish community, very large Haredi Jewish community, but also is a very diverse borough anyway. And this is a demonstration of school children organized by adult pro-Israel groups on the steps of Hackney Town Hall. I'm going to play it. I hope that the sound plays for you. But if the sound doesn't play, there are subtitles.
My name is Thailand, and this is what I believe. The Jews were rejected by every country apart from Palestine. They welcomed them, and that's the most worst thing they ever did. 75 years of killing, bombing. Why can't everyone see this? But them. Can't they just stop this genocide? Free.
Now, if I tell you, that wasn't, he wasn't the youngest speaker at that demonstration. And that wasn't the most anti-Semitic speech by a child at that demonstration either. But it's just one little snapshot of how there are things about Jews, Zionists, Israel, that are spreading. Charles, I think you're sharing your screen, sorry.
Sorry.
There are themes and ideas about Zionists and Israel and Jews that are becoming absolutely common amongst younger people. And we've seen so many examples of anti-Semitism in schools, so many in universities, and they all sort of follow the same pattern. It is a total disconnect in understanding about what Zionism is, about what Israel is doing, about why Israel exists, about the whole history of how Israel came to exist. I mean, I've got teenage kids, they are dealing with this with their classmates all the time. My daughter, who's at university, has had to deal with it with one of her lecturers as well. And it is this idea that Zionism is just Western colonialism, that the Israelis invaded Palestine in 1948 and stole all the land, and that's all there is to it. There's nothing else to it. And Israel is always the aggressor, and so on and so on. And it's this dehumanization of Israel and of Zionists, and it plays back onto young Jewish people and Jewish communities around the world, in Britain, and we've seen in the United States as well, on campuses there and so on. And I think the big challenge for us, I think this is the big challenge for us, So many of the other things, there are systems and structures in place, but this kind of generational shift, which is linked absolutely to the role that social media plays in supercharging and spreading these ideas. How do we combat these ideas? Right? How do we challenge them? How do we educate our young people? How do we educate other young people in broad mass of the population about the actual history, the reality of Israel today? The other thing, I finished by saying that if we'd been doing this talk about before 7th of October, it would have been different from now. And I'll finish on this and I'll open up for questions. The other way it would have been different is that I wouldn't have been talking about Israel anywhere near as much. You know, at CST, we don't do Israel advocacy, we don't do Israel lobbying, we don't talk about media bias in relation to Israel. We deal with anti-Semitism, security, hate crime, terrorism, all of that. And there's plenty of that going on that we still need to be dealing with now. But what happened on 7th of October and since was a reminder that you can't really separate the two, that the distinction between the two of them collapses as soon as Israel is at war, as soon as Israel is attacked in the way that Hamas attacked it, because so much of the anti-Semitism we see at the moment is driven by so many of these really dangerous and damaging narratives about Israel and about Zionism, all of which come back to some very basic, very old anti-Semitic stereotypes about that Jews are innately cruel and bloodthirsty and demonic, and that Jewish rights are contingent on Jewish behavior, and Jewish behavior is always or often bad and needs to be punished. And these are, like I say, ideas that have been around for centuries and are now playing out before our eyes in relation to Israel today. So I'll finish there. I'm very happy to take any questions from anyone. I don't know if you want to put them in the chat or put your hand up and speak.
So Dave, so thank you very much for a powerful and important presentation and for all the work you're doing. We appreciate it. I have a quick question, and I asked Daphne if you could post a picture. You know, you're putting all these photos up. I saw a photo, and one of the people in the photo was Tariq Ali, who's a well-known intellectual in the UK. And my question to you is, who's the person next to him? Is that Seamus Milne? This is the question. The final solution.
No. That guy's been identified. He was a Labour Party activist. I think he got kicked out of the Labour Party. He's now in one of the small far left groups. I know the police were trying to identify him, so he may have been arrested, possibly. The police have been much more assertive in arresting people for anti-Semitic placards on these protests than they ever were previously. It's one of the, it's taken a lot of pushing, but we've got them there. And it is one of the sort of positive developments, I think, over the last 2-3 months.
Okay, good.
But no, I haven't seen or heard from Seamus Milne since he stopped working for Jeremy Corbyn. No one really knows where he is. Okay.
And it's interesting that Tariq Ali is there in public with this sign. But anyways.
Yeah, I mean, he often speaks at these things as well. I mean, he's a veteran of the old 68 anti-Vietnam War campaigns, and that generation really did a lot to shape this politics.
Yeah. So, and the quick question I have is, what do you make of Jeremy Corbyn join? I know it's not exactly what you spoke about, but what's your impression of Corbyn joining the this tribunal with accusing Israel of genocide?
Of course he did. I mean, this is where he loves to be, you know, for a few reasons. Firstly, this is his real politics. You know, in 2009, one of the things that often got thrown at Jeremy Corbyn when he was leader of the Labour Party is that he referred to Hamas as his friends. But people often miss out the whole quote. And in the full quote, he said, you know, I'm going to invite my friends from Hamas to Parliament to visit. And he said, Hamas is an organization dedicated to social justice and political justice across the whole region. And it's completely wrong that they've been, banned as terrorists. They're not terrorists. And that's his politics. You know, he has condemned, you know, killing of civilians on the 7th of October. but he won't call Hamas a terrorist organization. And so for him to go along with this, look, firstly, he loves the limelight. He loves being the main man and the ego that comes with it. He does. But this is absolutely his politics. And, you know, the idea that Israel is committing genocide is, you know, absolutely the common sense assumption across so much of the left now.
Crazy. So thank you. Seema has a question.
Okay, I wrote it. Were there any polls done in the UK? And is this anti-Israel, anti-Zionism feeling, is it spread among other audiences?
Yeah, so there have been polls. And I mean, there's polling anyway. So in normal times, what you tend to find is around, look, most people in Britain don't care about any of this. That's the thing to remember. Most people have no opinion and they do not care. And if you force them to have an opinion, the opinion basically comes down to they're both as bad as each other and I wish they'd just, you know, sort it out, basically. Now, what you tend to get is between 15 and 25% of people who are committed to support one side or the other. And in the immediate aftermath of the 7th of October, a bigger chunk of people were sympathetic towards Israel. And the longer time progressed away from the 7th of October and the more the balance of the conflict shifted into, you know, fighting in Gaza and the Israeli invasion, the more the minority of people expressing sympathy for Palestinians outnumbered the minority still expressing sympathy for Israel. What you do tend to get is, again, amongst younger people, that's much more accentuated.
Yeah.
Amongst younger people, there's much less sympathy for Israel, much more for the Palestinians, and amongst especially younger people on the left. But still, most people don't care.
Okay.
Thank you. There's a question in the chat from Lawrence Bruce. He's asking, who's asking for the expulsion of the Israeli ambassador in the UK? And how do the PM and government, the British government, react to this issue?
Yeah, so the Israeli ambassador has come out with a few things that are, you know, probably a genuine, honest reflection of government policy, but don't play very well with kind of mainstream British public and media opinion about two states, about working with the Palestinian Authority, that kind of thing. And there is a petition which has had over 115,000 signatures, I think, to have her expelled. It's being pushed by a sort of pretty left-wing member of the Labour MP called Zara Sultana. She's quite young. The Labour Party has come on a long way since Jeremy Corbyn was leader. They've really changed in terms of they've dealt with the anti-Semitism very well, and they've held a much more sympathetic and understanding position towards Israel than even probably previous Labour leaders before Corbyn would have done. But they've been under an enormous amount of pressure from their membership, from constituents, and you know, this is partly a reflection of that, I think. But it's certainly not a there's no sort of mainstream politicians of influence who are calling for Israel, for the ambassador to be expelled. I mean, it's not really a serious thing.
Very good. Rafi Cohn has a question. Rafi, are you online to ask, or should I ask for you? I think I'll ask for him. Rafi, as a professor in the UK, asked what could be done when somebody encounters anti-Semitism in a university.
So the first thing to do is report it to CST, right? I say that to every audience. We have a full-time campus team who support Jewish students and academics all over the country. Look, it depends on what the incident actually involves. If it's criminal, then we can get the police involved. If it involves students, there may be disciplinary processes with the students. If it's an academic, it gets more tricky, I have to say, because students are understandably, I think, reluctant to take out complaints against their lecturers and their tutors. Imbalance, and it can affect their grades and so on. We try and empower Jewish students to challenge sort of extreme anti-Israel behavior and attitudes. on British campuses, I can't speak for other countries, but on British campuses, the vast majority of the anti-Semitism we see it's not violent. It's not people getting assaulted. I'm not saying it can't happen or never happens, but broadly speaking, it is offensive language, whether that is things on demonstrations, things on social media, it's threats, it's really extreme stuff about Israel and so on. And where appropriate, we try and empower Jewish students to have the knowledge and the learning and the support to challenge it, whether that's through direct complaints to the university or whether it's through actually taking on the arguments themselves.
Well, Rafi, I see you're online. Do you want to follow up with any question or comment?
Well, first of all, it's good that you are doing this Zoom on UK, because I think it's been a while since UK was on the agenda, usually in the United States. And there are many, many problems in the UK that need to be addressed. Unfortunately, anti-Semitism is going quite high, quite rampant, not only in campus, also off campus. And in addition to threats, there is intimidation. So this is what we see, chilling effect, meaning we don't want to deal with that. And if you mention anything to do with Israel or Palestine, then the authorities would say, not in our school. So instead of addressing issues, they don't want to deal with that. I think this is a major problem. So that's another form of intimidation. So don't touch it, don't talk about it. That lets it go, more or less. So you cannot address that. And the feelings in the UK, generally speaking, as I'm sure that David knows, are quite hostile to Israel nowadays. In the past 2 months, I mean, it was quite sympathetic to Israel on the 7th, 8th, 9th of October, but when the military campaign started, then it's reversed, and now the vast majority, I would think, of the people on the street, they are very sympathetic to Hamas, and Israel is losing many, many points in public opinion, and I'm very sorry about that. The thing is that we need to address this in a systematic way. And if ISGAP is interested to do something on campuses, then I'm not sure whether you, David, have a dedicated person or dedicated team to deal with campuses. But if you don't, then there should be, either in your organization or such, or ISGAP should have. But I think that many, many students and also faculty feel a bit left alone. Just the other week, I listened to a lecture, she didn't identify what institution, but she says that she received death threats from people, and there's no one to whom she can refer. So this is very, very sad, and I think it needs to be addressed by someone.
So, Rafi, we have 3 full-time staff at CST who work purely on campus, and they go all around the country visiting students and so on. And if people do experience threats, intimidation, anti-Semitism, we really want them to report it to us, and we can give them support. Whether that's personal support in terms of their personal safety and well-being, but also we can support them about making a complaint, whether that's to the university authorities, to the police, to, any others, and try and get action on individual incidents. But there's 2 challenges, I would say, on campus. One is the immediate challenge of what students and staff are experiencing right now and how to deal with those individual incidents that you're talking about. And that's something we can deal with and help with. The bigger challenge is the whole direction of academic teaching on these issues over decades that has generated this problem at this scale. And what we, and by we I mean as a Jewish community and as a Jewish world, can do to try and turn this around, which is a long-term, deep strategic problem and project that we need to address. And that is where it's not something we can do overnight. And that is where institutions like ISGAP and other institutions around the world who teach on anti-Semitism, what more can we do to try and alter the kind of the zeitgeist within academia in general, because in the same way that you're talking about what the atmosphere is like for people on campus, we're getting loads of complaints from people in the regular workplace about exactly the same thing. The hostile comments, the isolation, the lack of understanding, whether it's overt anti-Semitism or just the kind of extreme anti-Israel hatred that leaves Jewish staff, Jewish people feeling completely isolated. And we're getting that in lots of workplaces now. And it's an understanding or a misunderstanding of the conflict and a lack of sympathy and connection to Jewish people that is generated in part by what is taught in universities. And I do think that, you know, and I'm conscious I'm saying this to an academic audience, and as a, you know, academic partly myself, academia has a lot to answer for when it comes to this question of where does a lot of this kind of anti-Semitism come from. There's other types of anti-Semitism that come from other parts of society, but this kind of anti-Semitism.
Yeah, Dave, I want to. I think what you just said is so important, and this is, you know, this is the essence of what we're trying to do at ISGAP. And I think what people fail to understand is that ideas matter, and ideas that are developed in universities always filter down into society and affect policy, public discourse. Young people learn to be citizens in high institutions of higher education. And to me, this is really a front line. And it's going to take a generation to undo the damage of, you know, 30, 40 years of Edward Said and Foucault and the funding coming from the Middle East to undo this problem. But it's at the cutting edge. I'd like to call on Gloria Greenfield, who's a filmmaker who I hope you'll meet in the summer, Dave, when she comes to Oxford. And she's been doing films on these issues for a long time. So Gloria. Sorry, you're muted.
You're on mute.
David, what presence is there of international organizations that are leading the Jew hatred and or funding the Jew hatred in the UK, and also in comparison with other Western countries, what would you say the unique aspect of Jew hatred in the UK is?
So in terms of international organizations, no, all the organizations that organize all the protests and that stir everything up, they're all UK based, but some of them definitely have foreign links. You know, the ones on the left, the sort of British Marxist left, which is very well established and doesn't need any help from anyone else. But there's a lot of the kind of the Palestinian and Muslim organizations who organize the big rallies, for example, come from a Muslim Brotherhood background. A lot of them were set up by, and to a certain extent are still led by, Palestinian, Jordanian, Muslim Brotherhood activists who came to Britain in the 1990s. And of course, Palestinian, Jordanian, Muslim Brotherhood is, I mean, effectively Hamas to greater or lesser degrees. There's also some pro-Iranian groups. They are less influential, but they're definitely present. Now, whether these groups are currently getting funding from Iran or Qatar, or whether the far left groups are getting funding from Russia, I mean, no one knows, right? This is not something that gets exposed, but it wouldn't surprise me. And certainly in terms of politically where they're coming from, it fits that broader kind of global politics. In terms of the unique aspects, look, one thing that definitely plays in a big way is that Britain was the colonial power in Palestine between the end of the First World War and creation of the State of Israel. And therefore the idea that there is a historic British guilt and that the Balfour Declaration was a historic betrayal by Britain, and therefore Britain owes a particular debt to the Palestinians. That's one way it plays out. Another way it plays out that is particularly unique to Britain is that our connection to the Holocaust and Holocaust commemoration is quite different from other European countries because Britain was not occupied by Nazi Germany. So we have a much purer, more simplistic history when it comes to when it comes to Britain's role vis-a-vis the Holocaust. Now the reality is it's not quite simplistic, and there's more awareness and discussion now. The British attitude to Jewish refugees, for example, was much more complex and nuanced, but we don't have the whole troubled history of collaboration and occupation and resistance and how they interplay that a lot of countries in Europe have. So we can tell ourselves a much more simplistic story. So when people then take the history of the Holocaust and try and transplant it onto this conflict as a metaphor and a framing, it plays out in a different way. And the other way I'd say is, to the extent that Britain's Muslim community plays a role in this, and that anti-Semitism from within Muslim communities plays a role in this, which it does to a certain extent, although not as much as I think possibly in other countries. Britain's Muslim community is predominantly from South Asia, from Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, and then more recent waves of immigration, especially from East and West Africa. But the Arab part of the community is relatively small compared to, I think, other European countries such as France and Belgium and Sweden and so on. And that means it plays out in different ways. It doesn't mean they're any less committed to the issue. They really are. But it's almost like another step removed. So it almost has a symbolic role rather than a direct personal involvement in a way, which in some ways is kind of unhelpful, I think, because it gets used in even more abstract, symbolic ways. And because whatever anti-Semitism exists within Muslim communities in Britain normally doesn't really affect the Jewish community, because apart from one or two places around the country, they live in different places. And then at times like this, you get these big surges of anti-Semitism. A lot of it does come from more extreme, more radicalized parts of the Muslim community. And that's when you do see some sort of especially kind of Syrian, Lebanese sort of young men who are sort of at the cutting edge of these protests. And that's when that sort of comes out and plays out, and everyone's like, oh my God, what's going on? And then the rest of the time, we don't really see it.
Thank you. Charlie, you had your hand up for a while. You've been patient.
The question I have is basically in the U.S. university. First of all, I really appreciate your comments, Dave and Charles. In the U.S. universities, there seems to be lately a discussion about the correlation between the DEI movement and the anti-Semitic issues. And I'm wondering if these same forces are at work in the UK as well, please, if you have any thoughts there.
Yeah, they are. I mean, look, American politics, especially the kind of more radical fringes on left and right, they play out, they have a big influence in Britain, but they tend to play out in a softer, more diluted way, just because English sensibilities tend to do that to everything, basically. So we definitely have the whole DEI issue. I mean, right. It's a massive industry here, not just at universities, but in workplaces. And interestingly, so this really, after the murder of George Floyd, big corporations all over the place started bringing in loads of unconscious bias training and DEI training. I think it's called EDI here. They just swap the letters around for some reason. And we would start getting contacted by Jewish staff saying, we did this anti-racism training in my workplace and they never mentioned anti-Semitism. Can you come and do a session on anti-Semitism? And the workplaces would welcome it, and we'd go in and we'd do it, and it would work, right?
Right.
Now, on campuses, look, the whole identity politics, the whole framing, the whole of white supremacy and all the rest of it, it's absolutely there. It's there amongst the students, it's there amongst a lot of the academics, but obviously it's in a British context, and the British context is just different. The whole history of immigration, of people of color, of race relations is fundamentally different, has a completely different history here. It's a history of empire rather than a history of slavery in America and so on. And that influences how it plays out. But it is here. It is here. It's just not quite as kind of in your face in a way.
I'd make one other comment that was kind of interesting that you made earlier about your Holocaust Research Center. I happened to be in Washington last week, and I hadn't been to the Holocaust Memorial Museum in a long time. And I spent the morning there last Tuesday, and it was almost empty. People are scared to go there. It's first time I ever saw, it was eerie to go to the museum, the largest museum in the world for Holocaust research outside of Yad Vashem, and almost no one was there. It was a terrible feeling, just terrible.
Yeah, I mean, that's awful. And that's interesting because, we've had these two different sort of countervailing trends here. One, straight after 7th of October, lots of saying, I'm scared to go, is it safe to send my kids to Jewish school? Scared to go to shul, scared to go to their regular kosher restaurant where they go for lunch with their friends every week, that kind of thing. But at the same time, a lot of Jewish people, certainly once the initial shock had worn off, going completely the other way, going out and buying a big Star of David necklace, being more overtly Jewish, standing up for their identity. And actually, a lot of synagogues reporting that they're fuller than ever because people want to be together. They want to be in a safe space with other Jewish people. Now, the Holocaust Museum is something different, I think. But it's just an example of how the trends we're talking about are really impacting people's lives in a direct, day-to-day, granular kind of way. People, institutions, organizations. One of the things that's been really interesting in recent years in Britain is that Israeli restaurants are absolutely the most fashionable thing in London for the last few years. The whole narrative that Britain and London is, irredeemably anti-Israel and anti-Semitic and so on, it's not really true. And one of the examples of this is there are so many Israeli restaurants have opened up in London in recent years, and they are the most fashionable places to eat. And some of them, even after initially branding themselves as Middle Eastern, are openly Israeli. And since 7th of October, I mean, they've been empty. They've been struggling, really struggling. Sure. It's really hit them in a bad way, and it's a real shame. Hopefully, we'll get back to whatever counts as normal at some point.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? I see, Rafi, you have your hand up. You wanted to comment, but before Rafi takes the floor again, is there anybody that would like to ask a question or say something that has not spoken? Okay, I will turn to Rafi.
Advice, David. I was recently asked to join a committee that is organized by the municipality of Kingston upon Hull to organize Holocaust Remembrance Day, 28th of January, which is coming. Mm-hmm. And I attended my first meeting because I was away last year. I was in Sweden. So I was away and didn't take any involvement in that until now. I appeared last week only to realize that the Jews, two significant leaders in the Jewish community, pushed the municipality that this event will be online, meaning that they're going to post something on the internet, on the municipality website, and there will be a tick done. Everyone has a happy, and what I heard is I was flabbergasted because I think it's the wrong message to convey. First of all, to convey a message that we are timid people because they said we are afraid. And secondly, it makes the Holocaust a Jewish thing, meaning it's not something that is universal, that should worry the community of Hull or the world as such. But it's a Jewish thing, and the Jews can do their thing online, and we post it there. Whoever wants to see, they can see, and that's it. So I'm raising this as a comment, as a worrying comment, And secondly, the question is to what extent this is happening also in other places in England, or it's just a Hull thing?
So Holocaust Memorial Day week is something we're very conscious of, that it's, and there is a real risk, and I suspect this might be what's going on. There is a real risk that events will be disrupted either by protesters or just by speakers saying inappropriate things, making comparisons with Gaza. The online discourse is bound to be full of comparisons between Israel and Gaza. It could get quite messy. Now, I don't know what's happened in this particular case with this event. Our approach since 7th of October as CST has been to tell everyone, carry on as normal, don't cancel anything. We have loads of security all across the Jewish community. We work really closely with the police. We exist precisely so that these events can carry on, so the Jewish community doesn't have to hide away. And when the risk is greater, then yeah, we need more security and more policing, but we should carry on as normal. And what's interesting is during Hanukkah, we had way more Hanukkah events going on, public Hanukkah lightings this year than we had last year. And a lot of shuls around, a lot of places around the country insisted on doing it outside, not inside, not in the shul, because they wanted to be out and proud, and they wanted to, exactly as you were saying, show that we're not frightened and we have the right to do this. And it was a challenge for us providing security for all of them, because we had literally about 140 different Hanukkah events in London alone in 8 days that we had to provide security for. But it was wonderful. It told me that we have a resilient community. So I don't know exactly what's happened in this individual case. And there is an issue, there is a risk with HMD events, and people do need to be aware of it and prepare for it. But, you know, all things being equal, our view is always carry on, you know, keep calm and carry on as normal as we can, basically. And, you know, look, for all the problems, for all the things that are going on at the moment, Britain is not overwhelmingly an anti-Semitic country, far from it. It is still, you know, one of the safer, least anti-Semitic countries around for all the problems we have. And it, you know, we need to basically not be intimidated by the people trying to intimidate us, I would say, and not be scared to live our Jewish lives by the people trying to make us scared, because from within our bubble, it does look like there's so much anti-Semitism and everything's terrible. And out there in the rest of the society, the rest of the world, most people either don't care, or if you bring it to their attention, they're supportive and they're sympathetic. And that's something I think we need to try and cling on to.
I think on that optimistic note, Dave, on behalf of everybody, really, I want to thank you for a presentation, and I know we all wish you success and strength in your vital work. And CST is really a beacon in all of this balagan, as I say. So thank you, Dave. Thanks for taking the time to be with us.
Thank
Thanks.
you. Thank you, everyone.
Be well. See you soon.
Bye.
Bye.